We're starting to move past the middle of Lent here as we march on, fourth Sunday in Lent. Next week is the 5th, and then we are Palm Sunday, Holy Week, Easter. It is coming. So when we look at the readings that we have for today, this parable is a long one, but it's one of the more familiar ones, right? The prodigal son. We know it. It's embedded into Western culture to the extent that I bet you could go to the theater today and find a movie that in some way touches on the themes that come out of this story of the prodigal son. But this story has a couple of smaller stories that happen just before it that are also about things that are lost and found. We hear the story of the widow who has 10 silver coins, and she loses one, and so she tears her house apart, moves furniture, sweeps through the place until she finds it. And you'll notice that the story doesn't end with, aha! It ends with bringing the friends over to celebrate that the coin was found. It's a party. It's community. The other one in that same set of readings right there is about the lost sheep, right? 100 sheep. And one gets lost, and Jesus says, and who wouldn't leave the 99 in the wilderness to go find the one? It's one sheep out of 100, right? You don't leave the other 99 in the wilderness. It doesn't say, left carefully with the assistant shepherd in the barn. It doesn't say that. No, left in the wilderness. This says something crazy about God. That God's heart is for the stray and the lost and those who are in need of finding their way. Then we get to this story, right? It starts out, we have a father and 2 sons. Now, as the older brother of 2 boys, there are 3 of us, but 2 boys, I feel this one in my bones. So we have this story of the younger son who goes to the father and says, Dad, let's pretend like you're dead, and I get my part out of the will. Okay? Now, how does this story go? The story should go that there's much laughing, knee slapping. That's funny. Why don't you skip lunch and go out and bale more hay? That's how the story should go, right? But it doesn't. The father says, okay, give me a minute. Separates out his estate, gives the younger son what he asked for, and the younger son leaves and goes to a distant country. Now think about that. Now, if I was in Minnesota, this is where I would make a Fleet Farm reference. So you figure that the father has to go to some seed store, Fleet Farm, something, probably on the weekly basis, sees the other farmers, right? And you can just imagine, hey, there's Bob. You heard what happened at his house, right? The shame, the stigma. The son goes. He is in this other country and loses all of his money through dissolute living. It's a great little phrase there. And as he is spending all of his money, he's probably built up quite the crew around him that are excited about him spending all of his money, right? This is probably a fun time for a hot minute there. And then the famine comes. And he is out of resources, curiously then, out of friends, right? He had friends as long as he had money. Now he has no friends. And as a good Jewish kid, he is now hired on to feed the pigs in some good citizen's farming operation there. This is hard. He's discerning in his heart that this was maybe not the best path that I could have gone on. Now, we can get into all of the granular detail and say, well, was he honestly starting to rethink his life, or was this because he was hungry, or what's going on? In many ways, we're not supposed to read the parables in that fashion. We're supposed to read them kind of front to end and take it as it comes. That there is a change of heart. I've made a mistake. I did something wrong. I am going to go back to my father. I am going to tell him that I'm no longer worthy to be called his son, and would he please consider hiring him on as one of the field hands. This is difficult. There is a certain set of people, and we've seen it in the news over this last week on various communication issues that have come up in our government, of an inability by full grown-ups to say, I made a mistake. I am sorry. That is a sign of emotional maturity, to be able to do that. To not be able to do that is a sign of stunted emotional growth. It just is. There's no other way to describe that. One of the things that I learned on internship was that my supervisor never made any mistakes. It was difficult being in close proximity because by some strange chance, if a mistake did happen, and he, by definition, did not make it, it left a shorter list of people who had to then take responsibility for it. The younger son is there. Do you notice that the father sees him at a distance, which suggests to us that he has been watching, that he has been looking, that he has been hoping, and seeing him, he runs out to him. Now, you maybe grew up in a different house than I did, but the number of times I recall growing up seeing my father run is a short list of events where that took place. This idea that the father is just without shame. The excitement and sheer joy of seeing his younger son. And he dashes out, not even allowing the son to get his whole speech out before he embraces him and yells for the servants to what? Celebrate. Bring together the community. There would be music and food. Music, food. There would be a celebration of what's going on. Now, who is not excited about the younger son's return? I did read somewhere, I thought this was pretty good, the fatted calf was not excited that the younger son came back. But aside from the fatted calf, which fair, the older son. And I know I emphasized it a bit when I read the gospel text there, but did you notice the language? The older son comes in and says, "Your son." And the father responds, "Your brother." The older son has this sense that he deserves, that his place in the household is not because he's part of the family, but because he has been obedient. And that if the younger brother was not obedient, he can die in a ditch somewhere else. No empathy, no compassion. And this is for his own brother, or as he says, your son. Right? There is a certain level of callousness in our world today and in our nation today for those who are seen as your, and a carelessness with what might happen to their well-being, and in fact, if we think of the impact globally, their very lives. There is this stunted emotional development in regards to our ability to have empathy towards others and compassion. This parable we could call the prodigal son. I think we could call it the ridiculously forgiving and gracious father. In some ways would be a good way of describing it. But it also teaches us, like the other two stories I mentioned earlier, a lot about God's heart. This idea of a place in the household, this idea of compassion and empathy and love and forgiveness. All of this, as my younger daughter might have said a couple years ago, is just extra, right? It's beyond what the Father does. It's beyond what we would do. And I think that's the push for us. From the older son, perhaps we learn that we don't deserve. We receive because of grace alone. From the younger son, perhaps, we might learn the ability to say, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Will you forgive me? I want to return. And from the father, perhaps, a reflection of that extra graciousness and forgiveness, joy and celebration that we don't deserve. But because God is God, it's what we get. Amen.